but Isabella was the one holding the leash. She orchestrated the first kidnapping. I had just watched my father being led away in handcuffs, and I had carried my mother Isabella into the emergency ward with a heart full of desperate hope. I thought the nightmare was finally over, but when I stepped out into the long, flickering corridor to find Matteo, the man who had occupied every inch of my soul for the past few weeks was gone. I paced those halls until my legs burned, whispering his name into the shadows until my voice turned into a raspy, jagged edge. Every shadow looked like him. Every closing door sounded like his heartbeat. Desperation led me to the security room. There was my mother, the woman I had just risked everything to rescue, standing tall and imposing in the hallway. Matteo was there too, but he wasn't the defiant hunter I knew. He was on his knees, his shoulders hunched in a posture of pure, unadulterated agony. I saw her hand flash through the air, delivering a stinging slap that sent his head snapping to the side. She kicked his hand away with a coldness that made my skin crawl and pointed toward the exit. He stood up, defeated, and walked into the darkness of the parking lot, disappearing as if he had never existed at all. When I confronted her in her private suite, Isabella didn't even blink. Her voice remained soft and maternal. Matteo demanded shares in the company, Liam. He told me he wouldn't marry you unless I gave him a seat on the board. He was never your savior, my darling boy. He was just a scavenger, a common thief waiting for our empire to crumble so he could pick at the bones. You must forget him. Your father is gone, the board is in chaos, and the sterling legacy rests on your shoulders now. Don't let a common criminal break you. My name is Liam, 25 years old. I fell in love with my kidnapper, Matteo. Not out of fear, but because we were both victims of the same monster. We made a pact to bring my father down, to expose the blood on his hands. But the explosion that ended his reign also took Matteo away from me, leaving me alone in a mansion filled with ghosts and lies. The days that followed were a blur of legal battles, board meetings, and the suffocating weight of a crown I never asked for. I spent my nights in my father's old study, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 corporate secrets. The Sterling Group was a sinking ship, and everyone was looking to me to be the captain. One evening, while searching through a hidden compartment in my father's mahogany desk for shares certificates, my fingers brushed against a weathered, leather-bound folder. It looked out of place, hidden beneath decades of tax returns and contracts. I opened it, and time seemed to stop. There, in stark, unforgiving ink, was a birth certificate. But my name wasn't under the parents section. It was under adopted. I wasn't a Sterling by blood. I was a nameless orphan. My whole identity, the pride I felt for my lineage, it was all a beautifully crafted fabrication. But the rabbit hole went deeper. Tucked behind the adoption papers were stacks of private financial statements, none of which belonged to the company. They were personal debt logs, written in Isabella's elegant handwriting. She was a high-stakes gambler, a woman addicted to the thrill of the risk, owing tens of millions to international casinos and underground lenders. The truth hit me like a physical blow. She didn't want me to save the company. She wanted me to control it so she could bleed it dry to pay off her debts. She had played everyone. She had known about Matteo's grudge against my father, and she had steered him, perhaps even funded him, to orchestrate the kidnapping. She used his hatred to destroy my father, and she used my love for him to keep me distracted. I wasn't just a puppet. I was the collateral in a war between two monsters, and the man I loved had been discarded the moment his role was finished. Every "I love you" from my mother was a transaction. Every embrace was a chain. I sat in that dark office for hours, staring at my trembling hands, wondering if anything in my life had ever been real. The message came at 3 a.m., a ghost signal on an encrypted app I hadn't used in years. It simply said, "The old basement. Don't come alone if you aren't ready for the end." I didn't hesitate. I drove through the pouring rain, the city lights blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon. When I climbed down the rusted ladder, he was standing in the corner, a shadow among shadows. Matteo. He looked thinner, more tired, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant looking over his shoulder. But his eyes, those fierce amber eyes, still burned with the same intensity that had haunted my dreams. We didn't speak. Words were too small for the weight of what lay between us. We simply crashed into each other, an embrace so tight it felt like we were trying to fuse our broken souls back together. He told me everything. Isabella had approached him months ago, knowing about the tragedy his family suffered at the hands of my father. She promised him justice. She promised him a way to make the man who destroyed his life pay. He thought he was the hunter, but Isabella was the one holding the leash. She orchestrated the first kidnapping, giving him the floor plans, the schedules, the keys. But the moment my father was behind bars, she turned on him. She threatened to have him killed, and worse, she threatened to kill me if he didn't disappear. She told me you were her most valuable asset, Liam, he whispered against my hair, his voice thick with a mix of rage and regret. She said if I touched you again, she'd make sure you died in an accident before the police could even get to her. We weren't the kidnapper and the victim anymore. We were two survivors of the same wreckage, realizing that the person who was supposed to be our sanctuary was actually the architect of our pain. That night, amidst the dust and the ghosts of our past, we forged a silent pact. I would return to the Sterling mansion and play the part of the perfect, grieving heir. I would smile for the cameras and sign the documents she put in front of me. Meanwhile, Matteo would go underground, using his old connections to track the flow of her gambling debts and the illegal accounts she was using to funnel company money. We would let her climb to the very top of her pedestal, only to pull the rug out from under her feet when she least expected it. The game was no longer about survival. It was about the truth. It was the night of my official inauguration as the chairman of the board, the night Isabella had been waiting for her entire life. Her hand resting heavily on my shoulder, as if to claim me as her ultimate trophy. She leaned in and whispered, "Just sign the final transfer of the reserve funds, Liam. Then we can finally be free." I looked at the pen in my hand. I looked at the back of the hall. The doors swung open. Matteo came in wearing a suit, flanked by federal investigators. He carried a tablet that was wirelessly linked to the ballroom's massive screens. Before Isabella could even realize what was happening, the screens flickered to life, showing her gambling logs, her secret communications with underground lenders, and the forged documents she had used to frame my father for crimes he hadn't even committed. The room went silent. The air vanished. Isabella's face went through a terrifying transformation, from pride to confusion, then to a raw, jagged mask of pure fury. "I raised you, Liam. I saved you from the gutter, you ungrateful, pathetic orphan!" she screamed, her eyes bulging with madness. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, looking at the woman who had spent 25 years pretending to be my mother. "You didn't raise me, Isabella," I said, my voice steady for the first time in my life. "You invested in a puppet. You built a house of cards on top of my life and expected me to hold it up for you. But the puppet found his strings, and he's cutting them tonight." The Sterling Empire was dead, but for the first time, I could finally breathe. I walked away from it all. I signed the documents to dissolve my claim to the Sterling fortune, directing the remaining assets to a trust for the victims of financial fraud and the charities my father had once stepped on. I gave up the mansions, the sports cars, and the golden throne. I left the name behind. I wasn't Liam Sterling anymore. I was just Liam, a man with no history, but with a future that finally belonged to him. Now, Matteo and I live in a modest cabin on the edge of a vast emerald forest, far away from the screaming headlines and the cold eyes of the elite. Every morning, we watch the sunrise together from the porch, the golden light washing away the shadows of our past. There are no more masks, no more secrets, no more basements. Matteo didn't just kidnap me. He rescued me from a life that would have eventually killed my soul. He stole my heart, but in return, he gave me back my life. If you enjoyed our journey, please leave a comment to share your thoughts, rate us 5 stars, and hit that follow button so you won't miss our next stories. Thank you so much for listening.